Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 71 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Mike, that is Fia, and that is Gavin. Gavin, how's the sun feel right now?
It hurts, Mike. The sun hurts sometimes. I went to the beach, and I had a pretty bad tan line from wearing a baseball cap. And when you're bald, you need to be a lot more careful of a
Bald
lot of
problems.
things. Bald problems. And
Right,
so,
Fia, you know, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I get it.
I'm sure Fia relates. But so I did the right thing, and I was doing some yard work last week, and I put on a baseball cap. And sometimes I forget it, and I have to beg people for sunscreen. But this time I had a hat. However, I did not think about the fact that baseball caps have a little hole in the back of them that's like an oval shape for you to like adjust the strap, right? So I got a sunburn, or at least a tan. It didn't like hurt or anything like a sunburn, but there was a visible tan line for this oval on the back of my head. Very funny, right? Yeah, no, it's funny.
I'm enjoying just hearing about it.
And so we went to the beach yesterday, and I put some sunscreen on the very top of my head to keep that from absolutely frying. But I didn't put any sunscreen pretty much anywhere else. And the back of, like, the top of your back that's covered by a normal shirt but not by a tank top, and my shoulders are very sunburnt and very hurt. So
Can confirm, so I saw a picture, they're very sunburnt.
Yes, they have both seen it.
Those pictures looked pretty gnarly. Whereas, Fia, I'm assuming you have like figured out how to properly, protect yourself from the sun down in Louisiana.
Well, you would think that, but no.
That was a thought I had until I asked that question.
I actually was last weekend out, and I just really only care about putting sunscreen on my face. I think that is like, well, if at the very least, like that's what I do. And so like I put some sunscreen on my face, and then I wiped my hand like on my thigh. And then later that day, I found that I had sunscreen fingerprints where my leg was tan, but the sunscreen worked.
That's so funny.
Yeah, so
I've had that before too with my tattoos, where I'll put sunscreen just on the tattoos, and so the skin like immediately around the tattoos will be very white, and the rest of me will be sunburnt.
Yeah.
There was one time I went on vacation to Puerto Rico, and the first day there I fell asleep on the beach with my hand over my chest.
Oh no.
And I had not put on sunscreen.
No.
And so for the rest of the time I was there, I was just entirely burnt on the front of my body, except for this very nice arm and hand mark.
That's so funny.
Which is a great look, and I was not shirtless for most of the rest of that trip because of that.
You should have embraced it.
I should have, and I think at this point now in my old age, I probably would have embraced it. But at that time,
yeah.
No,
at that time I was a senior in college and not quite wise enough. Speaking of being wise enough, you're all about to get wiser here on episode 71 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. Because I've been told this is going to be a weird episode, we're all going to learn together today. We're all going to grow and just be better people today. I have no idea what this episode's about, but Gavin has assured me this is a wild one.
Yeah, so I've mentioned before that that plants scare me. I don't like them because they are so fundamentally different than animals, which is what I'm used to. And a lot of things that they do just don't make sense to someone who's used to working with animals. And so today, since Fia has joined the podcast, we've done our first invertebrate episode. And now that has further encouraged me to step a little more out of my comfort zone. So we're going to be talking about plants as a whole to sort of set up future episodes about various groups of plants.
Nice.
So we're going to be talking about plants, what makes them weird and special, what is a plant, because that is surprisingly very complicated.
Yeah.
And also just in an insultingly brief look at their evolutionary history. So yeah, that's going to be this episode. But before we get into that, we have a couple of things. First of all, some announcements, basically just the typical, hey, follow us on social media things. So we have a Twitter account that you should follow. at deadpodcast_. You can find that down below in the show notes, as well as several other links to leave us a voice review, as well as check out our YouTube channel. All those kinds of things really help out the podcast and just generally make us feel good about ourselves. So if you would like to make us feel good about ourselves, you can check out some of those links down below.
Yeah.
Gavin, I have a question about plants.
We'll probably... Actually, realistically, we probably won't get there, so what's up?
It's actually less about plants. It's
Okay.
actually about... I was going to say it's about humans, but really it's about me.
Okay.
And I think I've asked you this question before, but Gavin, why the hell can't I photosynthesize?
We'll talk about that.
All right. As long as I get a damn good answer.
We'll
Because
get there.
otherwise, this seems just like complete garbage that I can't photosynthesize, and I'm a little bit upset about it.
We'll get there. But
All right.
first, for
If
us
you
today,
say so.
Mike, do you have a today in history?
Sure. A real brief one today. April 27th in history in 1828, the Zoological Gardens in London opened up, and they are
cool.
still open today.
Wow.
Mhm.
Yeah, so I know very little about them, but there is apparently a gorilla kingdom, a Blackburn Pavilion, there's tigers and lions, there's Penguin Beach, according to this. So, yeah, it is still open to this day. It opened up 100, I guess, as of tomorrow, I believe it'll be 194 years ago.
Yeah,
So,
it's
yeah,
basically
the,
just a big old zoo. It's basically the London
Yeah.
Zoo, as most
It
people
is,
might
according
think of,
to
like
Wikipedia,
the New York Zoo.
Yeah, the world's oldest scientific zoo is what the opening line of the Wikipedia says.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's pretty neat.
So, London, good on you. I have no idea if I'm ever going to be in, in your city or even in your country, but or even on your continent. But good on you. Good on you for keeping a zoo open for a while.
Going on 200 years.
I was going to say, like, I mean, are we going to have a birthday party when they get to 200?
We realistically, as much as I would like to do that, we're not going to remember.
We're going to need some dedicated fans when they're going through our back catalog to remind us in about 6 years. Or
Yes.
5 years
6
and like
years.
11 months.
Oh,
All right, so that was
awesome.
today in history. So, Gavin, are we getting started with the episode now?
We sure are. So,
Let's do it.
as per usual, when we talk about a group of, I was going to say animals, but that's not true today, a group of organisms, I get Mike's opinion about what they are. But since Fia's also here, I'd like her opinion
Yes!
too. So we'll
Yes!
start with Mike for the lay person.
No! What?
So yeah, Mike,
Oh.
what is a plant?
Oh, man. All right, so a plant.
And I will
So-
say there are very few wrong answers here.
I feel like a key component of a plant is being able to make your own food, and I hesitate to say photosynthesize because I feel like there's enough. I think of like underwater plants, which probably don't do photosynthesis, but probably do some sort of like making your own food.
Okay.
I'm imagining they have some sort of they do the opposite of respiration, and I don't remember what the name of that would be, but they turn carbon dioxide into oxygen. I'm imagining that's a pretty key component.
That's part of
Unless that is just, I was going to say, as I was saying that, I was like, that's photosynthesis, isn't it?
You
it sure
did good.
is.
You did good.
Yeah, I got to the second thing there.
Yep.
Something to do with like water or a water-based substance, running through sort of like we would have blood, as veins. I don't know. Yeah, like you mentioned before, this seems rather difficult to define. It's we've mentioned the Supreme Court's definition of porn before. I know it when I see it, but
So in this case, that actually I don't think applies, because there are a lot of things that look like plants that might not be, and a lot of things that you probably wouldn't call a plant that technically is.
Okay, so I guess I'm going to stick with
a rare case of where that doesn't apply.
I'm going to stick with just they are able to make their own food. I'm assuming that is mostly through photosynthesis, although I am allowing for some other process that can make that happen. I think that's a core component of being a plant, and beyond that, I think I'm out. Fia, take it away.
Okay, so The first thing I think of is I want to say that they have to be eukaryotic.
What does that
Okay.
even mean? What is that word? Is that even
We'll
a
get
word?
there. We'll get there.
Oh, good God. All right.
But okay.
It's part of like your cells,
Mhm.
something about the cells.
That confuses me even more, but keep going.
I think that's really all I got.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess I want to go with Mike's being able to make their own energy. I don't necessarily. I feel like there are exceptions to photosynthesis being the primary way that they make their own energy, but I want to say just make your own energy.
Okay. All right. So that is just to sort of for me to help frame the rest of this conversation here. Because depending on who you ask, what is a plant and what is near planty but not quite planty, really depends on who you ask. So we'll break down some of those definitions for any of our less scientifically inclined listeners. This is going to get a bit technical, so I do apologize. We're going to get into some pretty significant scientific terminology in a little bit, so science content warning. But so, like most things in terms of grouping different groups of organisms, one of the first people to actually do it was Aristotle, way back in the 300s BC. So, according to him, he basically classified things into animal, vegetable, mineral. Very typical, old school way to split things up. So, basically, if it moved around and ate stuff, it was an animal. If it was clearly alive but didn't move around and eat stuff, it was a plant. And if it was not alive, it was mineral. So, according to many old school classical philosophers, a plant was basically something that was alive that didn't move around and eat stuff. So that would also include things like fungus, a lot of bacteria, which they didn't really know about at the time, but like things like algae, seaweed.
Okay, so algae is not a plant.
We'll get there.
Okay.
that's complicated.
What?
We'll
I'm
get
confused
there.
too, Mike. I'm confused too.
And like I said, this entire episode, I'm going to be like just slightly uncomfortable, and not just from the sunburn. Because, like I said, plants scare me, and I don't like them. But
When
they're
you say
really
you're
important to talk
uncomfortable,
about.
like, are you uncomfortable because you think this is an episode where there's a high probability you're going to get something wrong?
Oh, I for sure am going to get stuff wrong and leave stuff out, especially this episode. But because it's so complicated and it's such a big, important group of life, we got to talk about it.
All right.
So, what most people kind of know as plants, and a reason that many people sort of lump in fungus with plants, is because of a man, you might have heard of him, called Carolus Linnaeus.
Yeah.
Way back in, I hope that's sarcasm for you. In 1751. So this is before he published his full description of, how to name things. So for anyone who's not aware, potentially Fia, Carolus Linnaeus is the father of modern taxonomy. He basically introduced the kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species system that we still hesitantly use today. But that volume where he introduced that naming system and fully fleshed it out was put out, I think, sometime in the 1770s. But in 1751, he introduced the kingdom Vegetabilia, vegetables, that more or less followed Aristotle's thinking, where it's like, it's not an animal, but it's alive. So, again, also including things like algae, fungus, along with things that are actual plants.
It's very hard for me to wrap my head around the fact that, like, you would call a tree a vegetable. Like the whole tree.
Yeah. And I'm not sure. I'm sure that is some weird, like, Latin translation that's strange.
Yeah.
because I don't actually know where the word plant comes from. Like whether that's Greek or Latin. But you know, as most scientific names tend to be Greek or Latin. And here's going to be where we start getting to some of the really technical stuff. So, like I said, what is a plant depends on who you ask. So there is a concept in naming things that I did not include in our episode about taxonomy and cladistics, the Tree of Life episode. So there are basically, say you have a family, say the family that humans are in, which is Hominidae. That also can have a thing tacked on at the end that sort of dictates how broadly and loosely, or how, you know, narrowly and strictly you sort of interpret that group to be. So in Latin, these are sensu stricto, which means in the strictest sense; sensu lato, which is in the broader sense; sensu strictissimo, which is like the very, very strictest sense; or occasionally, I've never seen it before looking into this episode, but it makes sense. Sometimes you can put it as sensu person's name, where you're just saying, we're using this person's definition that they used previously.
Oh, like for just plants or in general? You've never seen that?
I think in general, I've never seen it before, but it makes sense. I don't think I've ever seen it notated quite that way, but I've definitely, like, it makes sense.
Yeah.
I probably should have written things that way in my thesis, now that I'm thinking about it.
Yeah,
but
that's what I have to do for a few terms that I use.
Yeah. So basically, if you have the same group, for example, Hominidae sensu stricto includes fewer things because it is the stricter sense than Hominidae sensu lato, because that is the more broad definition. So the definition of what exactly is a plant depends on how you use these suffixes, basically. We'll talk about which ones seem to be used more commonly and which ones tend to be not as well supported, but this is a part of taxonomy that kind of gets into the weeds that I wanted to sort of introduce as, hey, taxonomy is, because we are talking about, you know, Linnaeus, taxonomy is way more complicated than just kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, as we've talked about at length, but there's even more to it than we've talked about before. So, plants, sensu strictissimo, in the very strictest sense, would be what you would typically call a plant, a thing that you would see and that you would definitely say that is a plant. So basically, this includes non-vascular plants, which are things like your mosses and their similar things, groups of plants called liverworts and hornworts, very similar to mosses, as well as your vascular plants, which is basically every other kind of plant you're thinking of: ferns, trees, flowers, grass, etc. In the strictest sense, it only includes those things that you would call a plant. That is the Supreme Court definition of porn of plants. All right, and Mike is having some technical difficulties, so he may or may not be with us for the rest of this episode. Technology.
Sorry.
Anyway, so yeah, in the strictest sense, that is plants. The things that you would see and call a plant. In Plantae, which is the kingdom that we typically ascribe to plants, not the vegetable kingdom. That's not really what we call it anymore. It is the kingdom Plantae.
Okay, real quick, I want to go back to that vegetable thing, because I was pondering a little bit, and I guess I can kind of get on board with it because of the word vegetation.
Right, and I'm sure that just comes from the same root.
Right. But I was just thinking, and I was like trying to wrap my head around it.
No, that's a good thought.
Carry on.
So, getting more loose with our terminology for plants, we have the kingdom Plantae sensu stricto. So not strictissimo, just sensu stricto. This includes those things you would call plants, so mosses, ferns, trees, grass, flowers, etc. plus green algae and their descendants, which there is a group of planty things that live on land that are separately descended from green algae called stoneworts. Look very planty, but are not included in the main group of plants. And so that basically is all of the organisms that have all these cellular parts of a plant. They have a cell wall made out of cellulose, which is what makes like celery crunchy. That's what gives plants their structure, is they have cell walls made out of a compound called cellulose.
Okay, so is this for all plants or strict plants?
This is plants sensu stricto.
Okay.
So this is the stricter, not strictest, but in the strict sense.
Yeah.
And so it also, all of them have chloroplasts that use, there are different types of chlorophyll, which is the photosynthetic compound. There's chlorophylls A, B, and C, as well as several types of like carotenoids that are what plants use to photosynthesize when they are like, when leaves turn like yellow or brown or red in the autumn. They're using not chlorophyll, they're using a different compound, but so all of these in Plantae sensu stricto use chlorophyll A and B as their primary photosynthetic compound.
Cool.
And lastly, they store their energy in the form of starch. Starch. Yep. Starch is basically just a big clump of sugars smacked together in a particular way that forms starch. There's like slight variances between like potato starch and cornstarch, but it's pretty much all the same compound. So that is plants in the strict sense.
Got it. So I might have missed it, but did we talk about this cell type, like eukaryotic versus prokaryotic?
No. So all of these are going to be eukaryotes, which for the uninitiated just means that they have a cell with the parts of a cell that you are thinking of. You know, the nucleus, the mitochondria, the powerhouse
of the cell.
In this case, chloroplasts. But all of the parts on the inside of a cell that you were taught in school, if it has those various parts in separate little compartments, that is a eukaryotic cell. We'll talk about that a little bit more later when we talk about plant evolution. But that all plants are for sure eukaryotic. There are non-eukaryotic cells and organisms that do photosynthesis. And we'll talk about that because that's a big part of plant evolution. But those are not plants.
Okay.
And lastly, we have Plantae sensu lato, which is the broadest sense of plants, which includes all of those. So the normal plants, green algae, and things like red algae and brown algae. So they still do photosynthesis, but they use those other non-chlorophyll chemicals to do it, as well as a group called glaucophytes, another group of algae, but also do photosynthesis, but do it again slightly differently. They don't do those cellular things that we had just talked about. They do things just sort of their own slightly different way. Basically, this group is everything, but with a couple of exceptions that I will note later, that got their primary chloroplasts directly by engulfing cyanobacteria way back in the day. So for anybody who's not aware, which probably is a substantial portion of our listeners, there are some parts of our cells that we're pretty sure got there when our like great times a bajillion ancestors back when they were like amoebas went to eat something else, and instead of breaking it down decided to keep it as a pet, more or less.
Yes.
So that is how our mitochondria got there. That's why mitochondria have their own separate cell membrane, and why mitochondria have their own DNA. Chloroplasts are very similar to that. They have their own separate cell wall or cell membrane inside the cell, and I'm fairly sure they also have their own DNA.
I think I have heard that too.
So that is basically what this group is. Things that got their primary chloroplasts. Like I said, there are some other things that do photosynthesis that are not included here, but those do it without having like a proper chloroplast as an organelle in the cell. They just have chlorophyll, the chemical, just sort of in their cytoplasm, the little gooey stuff inside the cell. So that is the broadest sense of what plants is. In general, I think it's pretty much taken as the middle of those three is probably the most accurate one that we should be using. So that would be the Plantae sensu stricto.
Mm-hmm.
So that is land plants plus green algae and their descendants, the stoneworts. So that is one of the technical parts that we're going to be going through. There's one more pretty big one that I had to like watch several YouTube videos about to be like, okay, how does this actually work? That we'll get to in a second here. So that is, like I said, what seems to be the most generally widely accepted definition. But
okay, question.
Yeah.
When you did your YouTube search, did you watch a Hank Green video?
No, I did not, because what I was looking for, I think, was a little too specific. I had to go to like some like college course side of YouTube. But I do love everything Hank Green does.
Same.
So the two big features, I would say, that separate plants from animals, that if it does these two things, it is for sure a plant. One, photosynthesis. I guess if it does these two, if it does these two things together, like I said, there are lots of things that do photosynthesis. Not all of them are plants. If it does photosynthesis, it is eligible to be a plant. And so I guess to go back to Mike's question before he unfortunately had to leave us for this episode. Thanks, technology. But why he asked why.
Still here in spirit.
Oh, thanks, buddy. Yeah, we're just having some technical issues where his audio is being very piecemeal.
Don't you dare say we. I'm having some technical issues. The rest of the podcast is going to continue on as normal because, damn it, we don't take a week off.
Except for that 1 week.
Except for that 1 week.
Yeah, so to answer Mike's question why we can't do photosynthesis, that is because our ancestors did not, when they ate things with chlorophyll, they didn't keep it as a pet. That's why. That's the only reason. Practical reasons is that, clothes would really put a damper on photosynthesis because they would need to be on our skin, And so there are lots of...
I have a solution to that problem.
Okay, that's not the only problem. Animals in general also move around too much for photosynthesis to be particularly effective. And we also don't have access to a lot of the nutrients that plants need that they get from the soil. So unless we were just constantly eating dirt as well as our other food, it would not be practical. Long story short. Anyway, so
I think what you're trying to say is if Mike starts just eating like insane amounts of dirt, then maybe he will start to photosynthesize.
Sure, that's exactly what I'm saying.
There you go, Mike.
Yeah. So again, if it does photosynthesis, that makes it eligible to be a plant. But one thing for sure that plants do, that this is what I had to Google a lot and watch the YouTube videos of. So, plants do this very strange thing called alternation of generations. That I know that I learned about at some point in college, but I definitely forgot. So this is something that is so completely foreign to how animals live their life. So this is basically the life cycle of a plant. Step 1, fertilization. That part's the same as in animals. Sperm and egg get together, form an embryo. That embryo matures. It has the full 2 sets of chromosomes like animals do. In you have a pair for each chromosome. Right? Plants also have that for half of their generations. So when the sperm and egg come together, that is referred to as diploid. Di meaning 2. So they have diploid conditions, which means when thinking about mammals, that is the normal condition.
Right.
So sperm and egg fertilize. That organism then grows up to produce spores. Those spores are haploid, which means instead of having paired chromosomes, they just have one. Those spores then mature into... It will look different. It will not look the same as the other mature form. For example, the fern, when you think of a fern, that is, I believe, the diploid condition that produces the spores. The haploid, so the only one chromosome version, is this like little tiny, just like single leaf nub that sits very close to the ground.
Oh, so cute.
And so, but that is basically a fully mature organism. And that is what produces the sperm or egg that then get fertilized, that then gets mature again. So to compare it to animals, it would basically be like if random person produced a sperm or an egg that, without being fertilized, grew up into another different looking organism that then produced something that reproduced with another of its species to go back to step 1.
This is
again fundamentally very, very different from how animals live their life.
Yep.
And so that is something that is very fundamental to plants, though. So the best way to look at it, because I can't even tell you, so the versions are the sporophyte, that is the diploid one that produces the spores, and then there's the gametophyte, which produces the gametes, the sperm or egg. If you look at moss, the actual green part of it is, I believe, the sporophyte. And then the little skinny yellow things that sort of pop up out of the moss are the gametophyte, the part that produces the sperm or egg. Hi, this is editing, Gavin. I had some misinformation in there. I just said, if you missed it, that the green part of a moss is the sporophyte and that the yellow part that sticks up is the gametophyte. That was backwards. The green part that you think of as moss is the gametophyte, and the little yellowish part that sticks up is the sporophyte. Just wanted to correct the record on that. Thanks. Those are 2 different versions of the same plant.
And you need
if
both
that makes sense.
to make a baby, right?
So it's different steps of making a baby.
Okay.
And also, well, sort of. Again, plants are so weird. This is why I don't like plants.
Yeah.
But usually, what you are thinking of as the plant, the part that you typically see, is the part that's only got half of the normal number of chromosomes for an animal.
Okay.
So the part of the plant that you were typically thinking of, if I understand things correctly, which I may not be, things like an apple tree, that is where fertilization happens, which means that is the gametophyte, which means the actual tree itself only has 1 set of chromosomes instead of the 2 that you normally would think it should have if it were an animal.
And potentially, if it had 2, then it wouldn't be producing the apples?
Yes. Again, okay. If I am understanding it correctly.
Right.
I would love to have a botanist on, and please correct me. But as I understand it, as an animal scientist, that is how it seems to work. And if it sounds weird, it is, because we're animals.
Yeah.
So if you do those two things, you are a plant. Cool. So now we get into an absurdly, insultingly brief overview of major points in plant evolution. So, as with every group that we've sort of talked about, we talk about what they came from, if we have good evidence of it. And for plants, we sort of do. So, plants split off of their plant-like cousins. That would be the things like your red algae and your glaucophytes, those things that I mentioned that are included in the very broadest sense of plants, but most people don't actually consider them plants.
Okay.
So they split off from them somewhere during the Mesoproterozoic era, which is to say between 1.6 and 1 billion years ago. Long time.
Very long time.
And so we've talked about a couple of times that land plants did not come around at that time. Land plants are much more recent than 1.6 billion years, so what were plants doing in the meantime? Well, before that, they, like I said, gobbled up something that had chlorophyll and kept it as a pet inside of itself, and that's where we got chloroplasts from. And I had always sort of learned that land plants had sort of came up onto land during the Ordovician period. Maybe the late Cambrian period, but regardless, sometime around 490, 480 or so million years ago. So about half a billion years since they split off of their cousins. However, based on some recent research from the past 5-6 years, it actually kind of seems like what land plants evolved from was actually already on land.
What?
Right. So we think of how animals got onto land as that there were first animals in the water, then they crawled up on the beach and lived on land. Very oversimplified, but very broad strokes. That's how it worked.
Okay.
Not the case, seemingly, with plants. So there were not water plants first, at least in the sense that you would think of them. So there was not like underwater moss first. It basically seems like, based on the chemical evidence and some loose fossil evidence that we have, that land plants evolved from single-celled mats of algae that lived in freshwater streams and things on land. So they didn't rise up out of the ocean like animals did. They were already there. And then just simply grew towards the sun. They were like, hey, I need the sun anyway. I might as well get a little closer to it. And that already seems like what sort of happened. And so from roughly 1.2 billion years ago to around 446 million years ago, plants were just basically those single-celled mats. They were like algae lives in the ocean as well, but they were the ones that we would think of more like plants lived in freshwater or like very near shore ecosystems on land. Still did photosynthesis, still doing algae things. Then in the Ordovician period and then into the Silurian period, plants, and I wrote this in my notes here, shoot for the star, the sun. So first we get things like mosses, like I said, and then things like ferns. Those are the first two plant forms to sort of show up because they still need water. Plants like mosses and ferns have what are called flagellated sperm. Sperm, like you think of sperm, where it's the cell and it's got the little tail and it needs to swim. So it needs a fluid to swim in to get to the egg to fertilize. So that kept things like mosses and ferns pretty still near the water, which is why you don't find things like mosses or ferns in really dry climates, because even still today, they still need water.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. So those were the first types of plants to sort of show up. And then by the late Devonian period, so this would be somewhere in the vicinity of 380 or so million years ago, seed plants evolved, and because of that, were much less bound to the water. A seed is basically the animal equivalent of like an amniote egg. An egg that says, hey, I need water, but I don't want to be in the water. So I'm going to pick up the water and cover myself.
Yeah.
And I'm going to take the water with me. So seed plants, these first seed plants didn't, that you would recognize as a plant, obviously, but you wouldn't be like, oh, that's clearly a tree. That's clearly this kind of plant. They would look very strange. Still leafy, still planty, but would not look all that similar to any plants that we have today, particularly. And so, then after we get through the late Devonian, we get into the Carboniferous period. And the Carboniferous period is named the Carboniferous because of all of the plants that are there. Because during this time, we get the first like real forest ecosystems. Essentially, the planet was covered in giant forests and swamps.
Woohoo!
Yeah, swamps. So during this time, most of these plants, because the global climate was much warmer and much wetter, a lot of plants still needed a lot of water. They didn't need it like mosses and ferns do, so they still had seeds and things. But during this time, there was just a lot of really cool plant evolutionary innovation. So the first things that we would recognize as modern groups of plants sort of show up during this time. Mostly things like the conifers. The first conifer trees show up around the Carboniferous period. And then sort of right as they did, we get pretty much the only really significant plant mass extinction, which is called the Carboniferous rainforest collapse. At around 305 million years ago. And after that, plants had a real hard time. So the Carboniferous rainforest collapse basically happened because of a number of factors. One, the Carboniferous is when Pangea came together. And if your land mass is all one, that makes it really hard for water to get to the middle. Because this means that water has evaporated water and clouds and stuff has a lot farther to go to get to the middle. So the entire middle of Pangea was a giant desert. And not good for plants. And just the climate in general got cooler and drier. There was a pretty large glaciation event around this time as well. So things, got pretty cold, which rainforests tend to not like. And yeah, plants just had a really hard time through the Permian period and through the early Triassic period as well. So for roughly like 70 to 80 million years, plants were just not having a great time.
But like on the outskirts of Pangea, were they like...
Oh yeah. Like, yeah, there's still, obviously there were, pockets of forest and things like that existed in various places around the world. But compared to the Carboniferous period, where more or less the entire global land masses were rainforest, yeah, in general, not having a great time.
Got it.
That's not to say that plants weren't doing anything during this time, though. They just sort of kept doing their thing and didn't really recover a lot of their diversity until the late Triassic or into the Jurassic period. So this would be somewhere in the vicinity of 200 or so million years ago. Like I said, around the Carboniferous is when the first conifer trees, things like your pines, your spruces, your firs, show up around this time. And they basically, especially because they are particularly good in dry climates, after the Carboniferous rainforest collapse, they went on to dominate basically all of the macro plant niches.
Nice.
And then throughout the Mesozoic era, a very special group of these conifers split off and became what we would call today as the flowering plants. When this was pretty highly up for debate. Genetics, in my opinion, is wrong, because it suggests that flowering plants split off like 365 million years ago, which would be at least 150 million years before this. And we find no fossils to support that. So, and plant genetics are weird. I don't understand them. That's not to say that there's nobody who does. I'm sure that there are people who are, or people who do, but genetics and fossils don't always line up, and I prefer the fossils. So angiosperms, which is the name for the group of flowering plants. Basically, we see some pollen that looks very angiosperm-like in the Triassic. We see some flowering plant-like things in the Jurassic. But the first actual full fossils of flowering plants happen in the Cretaceous period, around 125 million years ago. Then, angiosperms basically go on to take over the entire world. If you can think of a plant, it is almost certainly a flowering plant. Unless it is a moss, a fern, or some kind of pine tree, it is a flowering plant. All of the crops that we eat are flowering plants, grasses, again, pretty much every tree besides, pines and firs are flowering plants.
Wait,
over
grass?
90%. Yeah. You might
Grass?
not think of it. You don't see its flowers, but that doesn't mean that they're not there. Yeah. So, again, if you are thinking of a plant, it is, 9 times out of 10 going to be a flowering plant. So they went on to dominate basically every thing that plants do. They even went back to the water. So things like seagrass are actual plants.
All right, yeah. I've been wondering about that throughout this podcast.
Yeah.
Like, where do seagrass fit in this?
So seagrass specifically is a type of flowering plant.
Wow. But they originated from land and then moved to water?
They sure did.
Cool.
Whereas things like kelp are not plants. Even in the, I don't even think in the very broad definition, I don't think they're included in plants.
That's
and
crazy.
What most people would call seaweed is also not considered plants.
Right.
Very weird. And so that is, again, a very broad, possibly slightly incorrect overview of plants and their evolutionary history. This was, again, made me very uncomfortable. If you want to hear more about a particular type of plant, I will be more than happy to be uncomfortable more. And yeah, so that's pretty much all I've got for this episode, unless you have any last burning questions.
No, I was waiting on the seagrass one.
Yeah, seagrass specifically, like I said, because I know that's also a very big marine ecosystem.
Yes.
Globally, seagrasses and seagrass beds are very important for a lot of different groups of marine organisms.
Yes.
That's like the main food for things like manatees. They serve as a lot of nurseries, because it basically, at least in most Caribbean is what I know the best, but the sort of succession goes mangroves right next to the shore, then seagrass beds, then out to the coral reefs. So the seagrass and the mangroves serve as nurseries for a lot of fish that live out on the reefs. And so because of that, they are really, really ecologically important for shallow marine ecosystems all across the world. But yeah, they are weirdly a flowering plant. They do all of their flowering and fertilization stuff underwater. they are more or less the only like really large group of flowering plants to do that.
Underwater,
I
you
think
mean?
I think there are some others that live in freshwater ecosystems that
Yep.
do something similar, but not as large of a group as seagrass.
Yeah.
Seagrasses are cool.
Seagrasses are so cool. I wrote a paper with my um, advisor about seagrasses and how they're important, and also sponges as well. So
Mm-hmm.
love seagrasses.
Yeah. So with that, I think we'll transition to our last segment of this week's episode, Swamp Corner. Sophia, what have you got for us?
Yeah. So this week on Swamp Corner, I didn't really have much to think about, but Gavin gave me a nice idea to talk about things I didn't expect about moving from, I guess, a more dry, forested New York climate to a more wetland swamp area like Louisiana.
Which is really funny because I personally wouldn't consider New York to be dry,
It's dry.
especially living in, having lived in South Dakota and now living in California. I would not call New York dry, but I'm sure according to, or, compared to the swamp, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, definitely. But I guess one of the things about living so close to the coast that I was not prepared for at all are pressure headaches. If any storms move in, I feel them in my brain.
Interesting.
Yeah, and so it's crazy because like you start to get a headache, and I've like it's happened to me a couple times, and I'm like, why do I have this headache? And I look outside, and it's like thunderstorming, and like I'm like, oh, I see now.
Huh.
And uh, the I don't know if it has to do with like how like where you're at like sea level compared to sea level, but I feel like it's something I've noticed, and that's weird. Yeah. Some other things that with this very warm, humid climate that I have discovered, or I guess I was prepared for, but not to the full extent, are cockroaches. Blah, gross. They are, you cannot escape them. They're everywhere. It's unfortunate. Also,
Interesting.
this one really came out of the blue. Termite season, which is now.
Yeah, I saw that in the notes. Like, what is termite season?
So, this happened last year around this time where I was just like, it was late at night and I was sitting in my room, and all of a sudden I like start seeing these things on the walls, and I'm like, what the heck? And it's a bug. And then like another one and another one comes out, and they're like coming through the holes and it like from the outlets, and I'm like, what is happening? And they're termites. So I guess like around this time of year is when they have their like mass spawning, and they are attracted to light. So if you have the lights on at night, they will find a way and come inside. Every person that I've talked to from here is just like, if it's termite season and you see termites, just turn your lights off and go to bed. And just hope for the best.
So that's really funny because when Mike was out here a couple weeks ago, I mentioned fire season in California, and he's like, that's crazy how there's just a fire season. And I'm like, yeah, I haven't really been out here for like the actual full extent of fire season, around like, late June, July, but yeah, it's weird how it's like, oh, you think, oh, New York has such, great seasons, and it's like, but does it have a fire season or a termite season?
Yeah,
it sure doesn't.
Yep. Some other cool things on the bright side that I was not expecting to have regular occurrences with are dolphins. Uh, at where I used to work down in Cocodrie, Louisiana, uh, is like right on the water of like the bayou channels,
Mm-hmm.
and dolphins would just come all the time and eat. I guess the reason why I wasn't expecting it is because the water here is so like muddy, and because Mississippi River. Um,
Right.
and I guess I just wasn't like expecting. I was like, oh, it's like it's a swamp. Like dolphins don't come here, but that was really cool to see. Um, the bird life down here too is like way cooler than I would have thought. Where I have now discovered my favorite bird, which is the roseate spoonbill.
Oh, I love roseate spoonbills.
They're so beautiful. If anyone listening gets a chance, you should definitely look them up because they are very, very cool. They're kind of a rare sighting to see, but
Mm-hmm.
they'll like pass through sometimes, and they're pretty cool, pretty cool. Um, so yeah, I think that's I would like to end it on good birds.
Nice.
Yeah,
Yeah. So if you too want to experience some up close too frequent dolphins and some cool spoon faced birds, um, come on down to the swamp.
yes.
You might have to suffer some headaches and some termites for part of the year, but dolphins make it worth it. Um, and in lieu of Mike not being here, I guess
Right.
it's up to me to do the outro. So thank you all so much for listening to episode 71 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Gavin. That was Mike, and that is Fia, and we will see you all next week. This episode of I Wish You Were Dead was written by Gavin Davidson and hosted by Gavin Davidson, Mike Bryson, and Fenella Campanino. It was sound edited and edited for YouTube by Gavin Davidson. Special thanks to former guests of the pod and to listeners like you.